But now I get to introduce the next, and this is really our last, it's not the last activity of the weekend, but it's the last major thought panel. And the focus, instead of being on us and what coeducation was like for us, is much more institutional. What was coeducation? What impact did it have? What is it continuing to have? And to the extent we have a future-looking panel, hopefully we will talk about what does coeducation mean today and even going forward. I have the opportunity to introduce someone who has been introduced at least 4 times so far, so I'm going to keep my comments brief. Peter Salovey is the 23rd president of Yale. He has been president since 2013, and I won't repeat anything more than to welcome him up to introduce the panel moderator. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm proud to be President 23. I get enormous amounts of clothing, particularly athletic wear, with the number 23 on it as a result. And that's Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. So I tease Rick. I always say, well, who was 22 anyway? I can't think of any great 22s. It's really an honor to be able to offer some introductory remarks for why coeducation matters. At this point in the 50th anniversary weekend, you have been a part of many crucial discussions about how coeducation began at Yale, and what it was like for the first trailblazers who transformed this university. And this afternoon, our panelists will explore further the meaning of this anniversary by examining past, present, and future of coeducation. I was thinking that it's hard to imagine a Yale without women, certainly Yale College without women. Last May, 659 of the 1,350 undergraduate degrees awarded at commencement went to women. This fall, of course, we welcomed just as many women as men into the Yale College class of 2023. By the way, all of those first years were wearing shirts that said 23 on it, and I thought, isn't this nice? They're greeting their president. Of course, that had nothing to do with me. Further, today, right now, 7 of the 15 deans of the undergraduate, professional, and graduate schools are women, but in February, as I mentioned to some of you yesterday, that number goes to 8, more than half, with the addition of Dr. Nancy Brown, the new dean of the Yale School of Medicine. The senior fellow of the Yale Corporation, who is on this panel, is a woman. But so was the previous senior fellow, and so was the senior fellow before her. Don't let the word fellow fool you. Coeducation has increased the representation of women in every kind of role at Yale, in universities around the world, in government agencies, businesses, and numerous other sectors as well. The women who led coeducation, who led the efforts in the 1960s and 70s, set the stage for our efforts today to increase representation of women in faculty positions and in leadership roles across all sectors. So these trailblazers are the ones who taught us, you are the ones who taught us how to have deeper discussions about inclusion, about diversity, about belonging for all individuals, for people of every gender and every way of understanding themselves. As we celebrate coeducation, we look to a future that's built on your work. Your triumphs, your experiences, your wisdom are what provide a foundation for students on campus today, and they help shape Yale and the world in the years ahead. So I have to thank you for the contributions that you have all made that have improved higher education and scholarship and research, especially here at Yale, but at institutions around this country, indeed around the globe. And I want to thank you, those of you who have remained interested in continuing to further higher education, especially the promise that the coeducation of Yale College presents to all of us. So it is a pleasure for me to introduce the moderator of this afternoon's panel, Karen Lawrence, from the class of 1971. Karen currently serves as the president of the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. Before that, she was the president for a decade of Sarah Lawrence College. She's a renowned educator, a scholar, a leader. She typifies the qualities that Yale aspires to inculcate among our students. So she will tell you about the rest of the panel, but join me in welcoming her and our colleagues here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, President Salovey, and it's a real pleasure. Can you hear me? Okay, I think we've got the mics solved, so that's good. It's a pleasure to be here and to introduce our esteemed panelists. I do want to say, as a graduate of 1971, that it's been a pleasure to relive the moments all together of our fishbowl existence, as it was called in the survey. And also, and the previous panel was fabulous in doing that, and also to place it in the cultural contexts in which it's embedded. And Sam Chauncey's discussion last night, the fireside chat, and also the panel yesterday on Yale's society in the 60s, I think really provided that very important context. I want to say one personal thing about that. I think for most of us who were here, coeducation is embedded in that context. And for me, it's almost impossible to think about it and my education without thinking about the political education and May Day. And so I just want to share one very quick vignette. I was in Davenport taking a Davenport College seminar with Anna Freud, one of the 15 lucky students in Davenport who could take the psychopathology of childhood with Anna Freud and Cy Lussman. And it was with ambivalence that I faced that moment when everybody made the decision and she was going to leave. But I was reminded at lunch by one of my roommates that the day before May Day, and I stayed and was involved in that with other folks, and the day before May Day, Anna Freud came and spoke to the Davenport students about her experience in the Blitz in World War II, and we gave her a Yale sweatshirt, and my most vivid memory is of Anna Freud putting on a big sweatshirt with a Y over her dress and totally unselfconsciously and smiling at everyone, and then she left, and she left the Yale campus, understandably leaving at that moment. But for me, those memories, and for many of us, I think, are very embedded in that context. So today, we are going to look back a little bit, but really concentrate, as President Salovey said, on the present and what's the unfinished business of coeducation, both at Yale and elsewhere, and what have we learned about it. You have the bios of our impressive panelists in your programs. They are seasoned administrators. I don't know that I'm going to ask you for the administrator's point of view. But I'm sure...
Fascinating though it would be.
Yeah, fascinating though it would be, it says. But everything that you've been and done will be part of what you know and your response. I'm going to just focus on their multiple connections to Yale and experiences of almost different Yales that they've had. So Cappy, or Catherine Bond Hill, is the former president of Vassar and currently managing director of Ithaca's S&R research and consulting initiatives to broaden access to higher education. She received her PhD in economics from Yale in 1985, at a time when I'm betting you were one of the few women, in at least one of two women in your classes. She has the vantage point of now serving on the board of Yale and US, and is successor and senior trustee of the Yale Corporation, and is President Emerita of Vassar. Kim Goff-Cruz experienced Yale as an undergraduate about 10 years after we did. She graduated in '83 and went to Yale Law School and graduated from the law school in '86. She previously served as assistant dean in the college and director of the Afro-American Cultural Center. And now her vantage point is as vice president for student life at Yale and secretary of the Yale Corporation. Marvin Chun serves as dean of Yale College and is the Richard M. Colgate Professor of Psychology with appointments in cognitive science and the Yale School of Medicine, Department of Neuroscience. He's also served as head of Berkeley College. I think Dick Broadhead, President Emeritus of Duke, wins the award for the most varied relation to Yale, on this panel at least. He graduated from an all-male Yale in 1968 and was a graduate student and a teaching assistant and then a faculty member, all while we were going through our educations, and served long and very successfully as dean of Yale College, and has the most comprehensive experience, I think, of different Yales. So I do want to look back, and I do want to talk about briefly, that transition, and bringing to bear your other experiences, but certainly the transitional experiences for you at that moment.
Well, I've been thinking about this, and let me say, listening to me is to me always fascinating, but being here this morning and hearing people tell all those particular personal stories of where different people found their friends, where different people found their opportunities and their futures, that was just so fun. So I'll just throw in my 2 cents. I came to Yale in 1964. Well, maybe I'll start this way. I was president of Duke for 13 years, and while I was there, we spent a year and a half celebrating a deeply significant 50th anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the admission of the first African-American students to Duke. Now, you can say, how is that possible? But it was a segregated state, let's remember, and although I went to Yale at the same time, Yale was not segregated, but there were 10 black students in a class of 1,000 when I was there, so it was something. Now, the interesting thing is, when Duke was integrated for college students in 1963, this was after there had already been 10 or maybe even 15 years of very active agitation about the issues of racial exclusion, not only on the Duke campus, but across the South, and Durham itself had been a center of this agitation going back to the early 1950s. Now, I put that in my mind and I compare it to what it was like to raise the subject of the admission of women to Yale in 1965, 6, 7. And here's what I got to tell you. I was a smart person, my classmates were smart people, but I just will admit it to you, when I came here, I did not come here because it was an all-male school or in hopes that it would soon be coeducated. My classmates understood that Yale was all-male. It had already been for 263 years by that point. So was every other school we would have gone to if we hadn't gone here. And so if you'd asked a male student at that time, why does Yale not have women? The answer would have been, I think, or let's put it more positively, why does Yale admit only men? I think the answer would have been, because it does, because that's just the way it is. None of us, I think, thought much more deeply about that. If you had said to any member of my class that Yale admitted only men because it had a mission to produce 1,000 male leaders, leaders, we all regarded that phrase with great scorn and dripping sarcasm whenever we mentioned it. So here was a place that was all male. Why? Because it just was. That was true in my freshman year. I do not remember a discussion of the subject in my freshman year. I don't remember a discussion in my sophomore year. I can remember the beginning of discussions in my junior year. And then it falls in the category of things that went from being unthinkable to mandatory without ever passing through the phase of reflection. All of a sudden, me and everybody I knew understood that it was now totally wrong for this place to be exclusive of women, and that it had to admit women as quickly as possible. It was in my senior year that Coeducation Week took place. Avi Soifer later taught my wife constitutional law. He's I knew him. We all participated in it, and people in my vintage believe that the reason Yale coeducated is because it was about to be coeducated by its students if it did not make the administrative concession to the fact. So there it is. It went from unthinkable to has to happen, and sure enough, it happened very quickly thereafter. But so now by now you've heard the reasons why Yale coeducated. Nancy Malkiel gave a very thought-provoking and I believe historically accurate strategic account of the administration's logic. And I could give, and you could give, an account based on morality and social justice, or even social policy of why Yale needed to coeducate. But I'm just going to give you the reasons why it was important to a young man who was a student at that time. And there'd be twofold. One, if you went here, you had a lot of great male friends, but friendship with women was an unknown phenomenon. Really, pretty much that's true. If you think about it, I had also gone to an all-male school for 4 years before I came here. You were used to schools being all-male, and then occasionally something happened in college that never happened in boarding school, which is buses would arrive and women would arrive, and they would go up the stairs, and then you'd go and ask them to dance and whatever you could possibly accomplish beyond that point, and then it was all over. And as I say, I'd have to say, no one regarded this as fun at the time. It was very distasteful. There was something, I don't want to use the word, but it's not too strong a word. There was something debasing, not only for the victims of it, but for oneself as well. And I did not regard road trips, Vassar meant road trips, and I did not regard road trips as that much more fun either. It was just the nature, did you ever read The Scarlet Letter? Remember what Hester Prynne wants to do at the end? She wants a utopian colony where someone will understand how to put the relations of men and women on a surer ground of mutual happiness. That's what Yale needed at that point. The relations of men and women were on a ground of total abnormality, total unnaturalness. And so it seems to me, I'd have to say, in my own personal life, reaching a state where women could be just your friends, where they could know you just as you, and you could know them just as them, that was actually something it took coeducation to produce at this university. By chance, I believe I attended the first fully coeducated class in Yale College. When I was a senior, I had to take Latin because I was going to go to graduate school, and you had to have passed tests in many languages. So I took first year Latin as a senior, but the class was filled with women in the graduate school there to pass their language requirements, who were graduate students in music and French. Nancy Vickers' friends were in this class. And I found all of a sudden you were in a class where half or more of the students were women, and we just became friends. And that was the beginning of a whole new chapter of maturity in my education. So it seems to me, in some sense, it was about humanizing life for coeducation. But then I discovered a second reason that I still wouldn't have been aware of in 1968. You've heard the strange fact. I entered graduate school in the fall of '68. My classmates were at least half women there, and I immediately had many women friends, including one who I married. That fall, it was announced that Yale would admit women. The following fall, women were admitted, and the following fall, I drew my first teaching assignment. Now, please keep in mind, I am a person who had only ever wanted to do one thing on earth, and that's probably still true, which was to be a college teacher. But I'd never done it, And so all of a sudden, in Alvin Kernan's Shakespeare class, I had to lead a discussion section of my first class. But by that point, the class already had a significant number of women in it. Lydia Wegman is here somewhere. Where are you? There you are. You were in my class. Is there anybody else who was in that class? Where are the rest of you? Yeah, you? Who are you? Yell me your name. I might have been. All right, so this room contains my actual and my potential students. Okay, but anyway, but here's the funny thing. So when I started teaching, of course, you know, this was a discussion section. It was not a lecture, so you went in and tried to ask interesting and provocative questions. And right away you found this is a piece of cake because people would just raise their hands and plunge in and begin to discuss all these interesting things. But I'd have to say the discussions in that class were different than they had been when I had been an undergraduate 2 short years before in all-male Yale. I never was a student in a coeducated Yale, and I never was a teacher in an uncoeducated Yale. But right away in that class, you saw, you know, women liked class discussion. They raised their hand, they plunged right into it. The students in my class, nothing reminded me of them so much as hearing the people on the panel this morning. All that vitality, all that articulateness, all that confidence, the just desire to go in and get at it. And you know, it had the funny thing, which is it actually made men behave differently in class discussion because male Yale, up till 1968, was under the tyranny of very oppressive stereotypes for men within the college, one of which is it's good to be intelligent, but it's not good to care too much about it. It's good to be intelligent, but not good to be intellectual. And so there was a kind of pose of, what shall we call it, relaxation. Gentlemanly leisure. I could if I would, you know what I'm talking about. And actually, the interesting thing is, once the class started and men were occupying the pose of gentlemanly leisure and women were making all the interesting points, that wasn't going to last very long. And soon the men discovered that they not only wanted to do this too, but could do it too. And I'd have to say, I'm not sure this point has been made as deeply as I would make it. The deepest change that coeducation made for Yale is that it made it an academically vibrant and vital place for its undergraduates. I would
Dick.
never, let me say one, don't show me the yellow card yet, I've got one more thing to say. No yellow card. Just one more thing. And in those classes, the whole point is, all of a sudden you had women in the classes. The point has been made many times. No one was ever there to be called on or to speak the woman's point of view. It would never have occurred to me to ask a student to say that. Nevertheless, if you have excluded half of humanity from your class before this point, you may be sure there's going to be points of view now present that used to be absent. And so it was not only the vibrancy, but also the fullness of consideration that was changed there. And then I remember something that happened in my second year, and I'm trying to make eye contact with Margaret Homans as I say this. You know, feminism came together with coeducation into the life of male students at Yale. And an interesting thing is, I can remember teaching, did any of you ever take English 25, Chaucer, Spencer, Milton, Pope? And you remember there's a poem by Pope that we all used to teach called Epistle to a Lady on the Character of Women. Remember its first line? Nothing so true as what you once let fall. Most women have no character at all. And then it goes on, and it's a very witty, brilliant poem. And at the end of the class, I remember a student, I'll tell you her name, though I do not know her since she graduated. Judy Fabricant was her name, very smart. She raised her hand and said, nevertheless, what do you think of somebody who would say, nothing so true as what you once let fall, most women have no character at all? And you know, just all of a sudden, I'd have to say, at that moment, you saw the scales fell from your eyes, and you realized the implicit selectivity, the implicit limitations of the things that had been taken for granted as true by everybody up to that point. That was the beginning
Dick,
of maybe later changes, but this is the very end.
We'll get into more of the curriculum and how it changed with women, but I do want to, yeah. In a couple of the panels, we were talking about when Yale changed, and I do want to ask, actually, whether one of the things that emerged of the cultural context was that there were more public school men who came to Yale leading up to coeducation, who might not have found it as bizarre to have women in the classroom. And so I just kind of want to ask about that point, that there were antecedent conditions.
Clearly there
or
were.
faculty who began to be hired from Midwest schools where...
Sure, and you can go read that history. The thing is, in the class of 67 was the first class that had a majority of public school matriculants. There had been as many as 65% from private schools, from private boarding schools, and I think at one point I heard more than 50% of Yale students used to come from the same 8 schools. I went to Andover. There were 45 people from my high school class in my freshman class when I came here. Guess what? The next year there were 22 from that school, and it never reached such a high number again. And surely that change helped to period. It's all part of a larger change,
Right.
but never, I'm just describing my personal experience of it.
Right, thank you. When we talk about coeducation, I think Sam Chauncey was quoted in the recent Alumni magazine as saying, people keep talking about coeducation as if this was some magical thing that never happened before anywhere else. And we're here because it was crucial to us, to the institution. That is what we're talking about. It is true that in 1955, 75% of all colleges and universities enrolled both male and female undergraduates. And that often comparisons are made, and there's wonderful literature on comparisons between elite men's schools. And sometimes in the literature, comparisons about the benefits of coeducation for women versus single-sex education. So these are parts of the discussion. I want to turn to Cappy, who was president of a college that went co-ed the other way around and admitted men as a minority to a majority female campus. And I share that with you at Sarah Lawrence. Vassar received Yale's proposal, as did Sarah Lawrence, rejected Yale's proposal, as Sarah Lawrence rejected Princeton's. Can you talk a little bit about that process and outcome?
So it's been wonderful to be here, and it was so interesting to hear people this morning. My own personal experience is actually more similar to yours. I was in the second class of all women at Williams College, which moved to coeducation a little bit more slowly than Yale, but not by much. My entering class was the fall of '72, and I graduated in '76, so a lot of very common experiences. And then I went back to Williams to teach and was provost, and then went to the Vassar position. When I went from Williams to Vassar, of course, I dug into the archives to find out about this period of time when both Williams went co-ed and Yale went co-ed and Vassar went co-ed. And it was really fun to learn a little bit about the history. It had really started in the early 60s in the archives. You could see the presidents starting to really worry about what was going to happen, as it was clear the demographics were changing and what students were interested in was changing as well. I couldn't get to town in time to hear Nancy's talk yesterday, but we actually talked quite a lot when she was working on her book, because she was trying to dig into the Vassar data on what happened to the student body during this period of time. So anyway, I learned a lot about Vassar going co-ed and just some interesting stories, I think. Very early on when I was at Vassar, I was meeting with the class of '69, and they were the last all-female class at Vassar, about which they were quite proud. But it was so interesting the first time I met with them, because they were very divided on what the right path was for Vassar. Some of them were just completely appalled by the notion that Vassar would have merged with Yale. Some of them were quite appalled that it was going to go co-ed. And some of them just were really sad that they didn't get a chance to have a Yale degree. So it was this very mixed history of that class. So Vassar goes co-ed. It goes co-ed for many of the same reasons that Williams did, which was that it was clear, and I think Nancy's book makes this point, that the world had changed and it was going to be very hard to survive in an isolated community as a single-sex institution. What it did at Vassar was change the pool of students who were applying to go there. Before, for many of you, I think many of you actually started at one of the women's, the Seven Sisters, and then transferred. You didn't have the option of going to Princeton or Yale or Williams or Amherst. Once those opportunities arose, you made a more decided decision about what kind of an institution you wanted to go to. And I would say that what happened at Vassar was that the applicant pool changed from women who would have applied to Princeton or Yale or Williams or Amherst if it were an opportunity, to women who wanted to go to an elite private nonprofit institution with wonderful faculty, but that had a history of being a women's college and wanted to be at an institution that was less masculine in a way. So the pool changed to women who were more self-selecting to go to Vassar. The male students that were coming, I would say, were similar in the same way. They were making a decision that they wanted to go to an institution that was not as masculine as some other institutions now that this opportunity was available. And they fell into a variety of, I think, different camps. We had a longtime admissions director who was really a wonderful person who was there for quite a long time. He's passed away, so I feel okay telling a story about him. But he talked about the applicant pool of young men, often being young men who, had been bullied in high school by by other men, or young boys at that point, and wanted an environment that was not like that. And so I think we ended up with a much more selective applicant pool, both on the part of men and women who wanted the kind of environment that a college that had 150 years of educating women was going to be a comfortable environment for them.
Which suggests that there's something in the DNA that carries on from the history of having been an all-women's college. And that might also suggest that the same thing happens in a college that goes co-ed and admits women. I think we've been talking about going co-ed as if it's an arrival or a destination, but in fact, it's a process. So I'd like to turn to Kim and Marvin to ask about, is that DNA still at Yale in some sort of palpable way in terms of the unfinished business of coeducation, or is there a sense of that for students today?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed the sessions yesterday and today, especially the one this morning. It's very inspiring for me in my role as dean to hear about our histories and to see your adventurous and your resilient selves really forging a path for Yale to be what it is today, which I do think is a really outstanding place for educating all our students. I'm looking at my name card over here, and I look very undereducated. Everyone else has all these fancy credentials, but I wanted to point that out because there is one credential that's missing here, which is that I'm a parent. My daughter is a junior here, and so I get to see what an incredible place Yale is through her eyes. And thank you. For me, the value of coeducation really just rests on the fact that if our students, if our faculty, if we as a community, if our mission is to serve the world, then we really need to look like the world. And it kind of everything really boils down to that very simple fact. With regards to unfinished work, I think, of course, we've made amazing progress, and Yale now is very, very different from the Yale I've been hearing about over the past 2 days, but there's still work to do. I think one area is that we do need more diversity in our faculty. It came up in discussion yesterday that 32% of our latter faculty in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences are women, which is great progress. It's as high as it's ever been, but of course it's still quite distant from 50%. But there's an aspect of those data that's very promising, and Dean Tamar Gendler here can say more about it, perhaps. But a very promising aspect of those data is that it's 32% because that's the entire faculty, ranging from recently PhD'd to people who've been here for 30, 40 years. If you just look at the cohort of new faculty who arrived here in the past 10 years, 45% of the new faculty are women. So I think the trends are looking very good, thanks to the good efforts of our president and Dean Gendler. And these are, I think this is very important for our student body, which of course has parity, to have a faculty that that represents what the students are like. In terms of another challenge for undergraduate students, 47% of our STEM students are women. So that's, there's... But you may know that still women representation in STEM is low around the country, and this is a number that we have to stay focused on. There are still some fields where the proportion of women are lower than 47%, and that's an important priority for me to raise in my role as dean. So I think I'll
So first of all, I did graduate 10 years after you, and so it's actually wonderful to be able to see the shoulders that I'm standing on in person. So it's been really wonderful to hear your voices, and I'll spend all the day with you to hear some more about your stories. I also have the privilege of being secretary and also the vice president for student life here, and that means that I'm very focused on the student experience largely outside of the classroom. So I like to say that I focus on where students eat, sleep, play, pray, and pay. Anything outside the classroom is fine. And I think about that for all students, not just the college, but all students on campus. But having been a member of the college, both in the dean's office and also I worked for Dick actually, and also an undergraduate, I do have a special place in my heart for the undergraduates that I work with and the leadership that I work with. I think that what we would say to you in terms of, and now I'm channeling a lot of their voices, is that yes, coeducation has worked in terms of the diversity, in terms of the number, but we are all focused on issues of equity, inclusion, and belonging. And what that means is that we are focused on making sure that all of our students have equal opportunity here in ways that focus on the legal definition of legal equity, but also that they feel included, that they always feel as if they have opportunities that are meaningful for them and that they belong, which means they can be their authentic self. And so a lot of our student leaders, particularly the women leaders, are focused on those aspects of what it means to be at Yale and feel that although we have made progress, that's some of the areas that we really need to focus on. I think of Title IX as being one of the issues that many of our students, and we have to name that because that is something very much in our students' minds right now in terms of the campus climate, which has improved and which we are all still working on including. I think of very much this group of young women being multi-hyphenates and intersectional, that they are very much focused on gender and, because they always think of themselves as being multiple and holistic in their view. And so what does that mean? In fact, just this week the women leaders talked to me about making sure that they could see themselves in a variety of ways and not just as women. So we can have more conversation about that, but I think the demographic piece we have done well at Yale College, but I think it's the inclusion and more the belonging piece that we are now all focused on, student leaders and the rest of us, in terms of making this the best experience for these young women to have here.
Great. There are two directions I'd love to go in relation to what you both have said. One is actually to follow up on your experience, Marvin, as a parent, and the sense of the climate with the daughter here. And I've been talking to people, and that's something we haven't really talked about, is the experience of the children of our class, and whether that's, how they experience. And now I guess I am asking you to speak for your daughter, and I was asking people not to speak for someone else. But I'm interested in that, and maybe from the audience, if there's any comment about the kind of climate or in the DNA of a school, its history, or have your daughters or sons felt a very different, obviously a very different environment. I mean, there's no question, but anybody want to? Yeah, Susan.
I'm Susan Waceburn from class of 71. I have two daughters who were in graduate programs here, in the art history program and then a resident at the medical school. And what struck me is something that I struggled with when I was here, which was I wanted the opportunities of being a man, but I didn't want to live my life as a man in terms of my career. And watching my daughters now, who are young mothers as well, they're being crushed by the amount of responsibilities that they have. And I say to them, now that you're 50% doctors, now that you're, 50% almost professors, you need to stand up for how can a woman be a mother and also her career, and not have 4 overnights a week during her residency.
So the advantages and some of the tribulations that come from those opportunities. I don't know, Marvin, if you want to say anything else about the next generation.
So over 50 years, and in fact, even in the past 10 years, we continue to evolve and try to make this a more inclusive climate. One area that seems now very natural, but definitely did not exist 10 years ago, is that our housing is gender neutral now. So the bathrooms have always been gender neutral, and shared, but the housing, the configurations themselves have gone gender neutral over the past 10 years, recently extended to first-year students as well. So we continue to evolve in that sense. I'm going to choose not to represent my daughter because she doesn't like that. but in general, speaking again with my administrative hat, I think progress continues to be made. Challenges in areas where we still need to work on. There still exist gendered social spaces. On the bright side, organizations, groups like the Whiffenpoofs have gone co-ed last year, as I'm sure many of you are aware. But there are still many singing groups that are single sex. There are still Greek organizations that are single sex. These are areas that we have to continue to attend to.
And I would say, I think going to your specific story, is what you see a lot in this particular generation of young women in the college is conversations about balance and wellness. So as a generation, they have really been focusing on how best to manage their time and their energy. They are also talking about the concept of effortless perfection and trying to sort of kill that dragon at the same time. So we spend a lot of time developing programs that address that issue. In fact, Laurie Santos had a course a couple of years ago called The Psychology of the Good Life. And we have built the Good Life Center in Silliman College, if some of you have a chance to look at it, which basically offers classes that help you make a decision about how you're going to manage your time and your energy, but also how do you manage your life and how do you think things through. So there's ways in which this generation is just much more focused on making sure, certainly I'm talking about the college now, not your students are a little bit older than them, but the college, the young women are much more focused on trying to make sure that they have a balanced life.
And it also raises the question of professions.
Yes.
And being at Yale as a graduate student, I mentioned, so you were one of 2, Cappy, in economics. But how do we need to see our discussion of undergraduate coeducation within a lens that includes professions that women enter and the different times, the different time periods where various fields, admitted women had more women. What about your experience?
I'm hoping we'll continue to see things evolve over time. And I think as we have more women faculty coming up through the ranks, as we have more women lawyers, more women doctors, that they will start thinking about the workplace and making sure that it's a place that's comfortable for not just women, but men as they try to have lives outside of their professions. I'm seeing amongst the generation, I have 3 kids who are all not quite there yet, but thinking about these issues, both 2 boys and a girl, and they care about balance, all of them do. And so I think this generation is gonna bring those values into the workplace, and that's what we need them to do to make it more reasonable for both men and women to lead lives that work. So,
Kim, I want to follow up on what you said about gender fluidity and again, the term coeducation presupposes binary, or mostly presupposes that. And as you've pointed out on college campuses today, there's a very different discussion, vocabulary, and climate around sexual identification, gender identification. How how do we need to think about that in relation to the discussion about coeducation?
Well, we think about it certainly in terms of, as Marvin mentioned, gender-neutral bathrooms. And you saw the all-gender bathrooms that are right down the hall. And how do you negotiate that when you have multiple generations? Some of us actually still want men and women's bathroom. So how do you manage that with students who are looking for something different? But we also have, we're looking at things, very basic things like, how do we account for someone's changing gender or their gender identity on class lists, because they're generated very much by, our database. And how do we help faculty understand who is in front of them? How do we help faculty understand the person whose name that might be legally Michael might be Michelle at some point? So we've got systems in place that we've designed to make sure that an accurate identity is in front of the faculty members. And we are actually doing a lot of training with faculty and staff and students about transgender students, which is a very big component of the population of students, student issues on campus across the country. So we're always thinking about gender broader than just male, female. Even in my reports that I get from my staff about who's in the room, and they're giving me a list of students I might meet, they'll say something like, well, we have 4 people presenting as male. So even our language has shifted in terms of how we address the issue, but it's certainly our policies, our programs, and even some of our buildings are sort of addressing that. So we've got to be much broader in terms of how we think about these issues.
Let me throw that open to anyone else on the panel to talk about intersectionalities and fluidity of gender and just the way of thinking about who comes to the college and inclusion and how they feel included.
Anybody else?
Intersectionality and inclusion are interacting and overlapping, but by no means identical issues. It seems to me, Cappy is one of the most famous people in the country associated with the idea of promoting inclusion. And I'd have to say, anybody who said nowadays, was coeducation over? Was it accomplished when women took up their places as students? Yes and no, right? It was and it wasn't. It was because they were here. It wasn't because Yale needed to be remade to become the place they would be fully able to live up to their highest potential in. But I think anybody who lived here at the time realizes the deepest thing coeducation did to Yale is to induce the habit every so often of looking at the university and asking yourself, I know it's great, but is it really? Does this place really serve the mission it push forward in the world? And at a certain point, Yale couldn't answer that question when it excluded women. And so women were included. Certainly it happened the same with the question of race in a significant way, also in the late 60s and early 70s. And now, of course, we are much more preoccupied with socioeconomic questions, now that we know the very high correlation between family income, level of from birth to going to college preparation, over preparation, grooming that people get, and how those correlate. And so I think that's really, I think as someone who was until very recently a university president, I would say that's been the new horizon, the main new horizon of that coeducation opened up for us. And the thing is, even when that is solved to our satisfaction, I hope after about 5 years, people will say, all right, we've reached the stage of self-satisfaction again. Now let's ask the question again. Is this place actually open to all the people it has a mission to serve?
Yeah, I think just one of the real challenges on college campuses is getting students to listen to each other. And as our communities become significantly more diverse, just one of the real advantages of being here for 4 years is to learn from people that have had different experiences. And sometimes I think there's a tendency to not let that happen and to choose one identity and feel like you need to somehow defend it. And I think certainly my time at Vassar was reminding students to take advantage of the amazing diversity of the campus and not only speak up, but listen to their peers about their experiences as well.
Great. I want to open it up now for questions for the remainder of our time. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Susan Cherniak Way, 1971, Calhoun. I wonder whether any thought's been given at Yale in addressing coeducation values through modifications of traditional pedagogy. We know that co-ed and all-male classrooms, the dynamics are quite different from all-female classrooms. We also know that female instructors are challenged much more frequently by both male and female students than are male instructors. And finally, we know that the traditional pedagogical model at Yale, the sage on the stage, well, usually a guy in a tweed jacket, something like that, maybe a woman who is following that model, maybe suits a kind of masculine culture, but may not bring out the strength in a feminine culture or something in between. So my question, I think, going beyond the question of how to retain the best women instructors to build a truly diverse faculty, what is being done to examine pedagogical models that are popular at Yale? I'll only say this, and this may be too ancient history. I don't know whether you remember the old joke I heard when I came to Yale. How many Yaleys does it take to screw in a light bulb? One to screw it in and one to kick out the stool underneath him while he's trying to do it. When I came to Yale, I was really stunned at the level of brutal competition, finding pages and books razored out that had been left on reserve and cross-campus and so on, and that there were no rules when it came to winning. I'm assuming that's moderated over time, but the kind of valorization of that kind of competition and the valorization of a highly authoritative professor, I think speaks to a kind of DNA at Yale that may need some reexamination. So what do you think?
Well, I wonder if I could pitch into this. You've just described Yale. I've been here all that time, right? Until I was here for 40 years from my first freshman day until I left the faculty. The Yale you describe of the man knocking the stool out from another is not one I ever knew. I never experienced that kind of competitiveness at this place. I think if women had come to a place that had that culture, it would have been very different, and I bet even that would have had a modifying force in it. But don't forget, as for the model of pedagogy, let me just say, I was a department chair, I was a dean. The greatest lecturers in my department included both men and women. The greatest seminar, Susie Wofford is in this room, your classmate, who was such a great one then. Tamar Gendler, a great one of more modern vintage. But the great majority of Yale instruction is done in small groups, where that's and where it does not, and small groups never work if it's all me on the part of the faculty. Finding a way to be gifted at seminar instruction is one of the really powerful things universities teach students, because it has to do, how do you find an interesting question, and then how do you create the space where different people can hazard some portion of the answer and learn from each other. That's a great thing universities teach people, and it seems to me the small group culture at Yale was strong from my earliest days on the faculty, and I believe is probably even stronger now.
I also think there's a lot more emphasis on helping faculty think about pedagogy so that their classroom can be supportive for everybody that's around the table. That was not something that you learned in graduate school when I was here, but now it is something that institutions are much more conscious of. And I just want to say, there were 30 people in the Econ PhD program the year I came, 2 women. It was incredibly supportive, and I loved every minute of it. So I also did not experience that. And other PhD programs had other reputations,
right, sure.
And so part of the reason for coming to Yale was precisely because it did not have that reputation.
Yeah, and I just have to add and dump on I think we're very fortunate that our reputation in higher education, especially amongst this generation of students, is that we are a strong community, we are a collaborative community, we are supportive of each other. So this competitive notion, I think, really lives in the past. I also want to add that we do surveys, we analyze the effectiveness of teachers and how students view their teachers, both for small classes and large classes. And on average, our women faculty actually receive numerically higher ratings from the students than the male faculty do, if we break it down by that, by gender. The second thing I'll say is that regarding the kind of the big, authoritative, large lectures, this course by Professor Laurie Santos is the largest in Yale College history, and so I think it's because of her charisma and the respect that students have for who she is that has led to its size. Even this semester, the largest class is taught by a woman, my wife, and even though she's going against, at the same time, a distinguished male professor, Akil Amar of constitutional law. So I think the culture is pretty good.
And also, just so you know, that right across the street is a physical manifestation of our commitment to pedagogy, which is the Porvoo Center for Teaching and Learning, which does a lot of training of faculty about new ways of teaching and experiential learning and how to deal with people who are introverted. So all kinds of ways of making sure the class dynamics are really rich, because if they weren't, we probably wouldn't be getting as many students as we are. That is our commitment.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of change in the way on multiple campuses, how people are trained in pedagogical, to think about that and teaching. But I have to say, I think that Yale has always been focused on undergraduate teaching in a very real, authentic way. As part of the university, it's not a place where the only thing that faculty cared about when we were there and now is research and not how that enters into the classroom and what happens among students. So, yeah, back there.
While the microphone comes, I'll say my name is Kate Moore, class of 73. Did you hear that? I have a question, not a speech, and I'd like to direct the question primarily to Kimberly and to Marvin. Is that right? We have the rise of the cultural centers, but what mechanisms are we actively using to promote civil discourse among the different cultural components of the student body?
That goes back to Cappy's question as well. Kim?
So one of the things we've been focusing on for the last year and a half is what we call training students on how to have difficult conversations. This is one of the things that actually came up from the student body. We have an advisory group of talking about what are some of the issues we should be dealing with, and this is one of the things that they all said we need to be focusing on. Marvin and I, and actually mostly Marvin's going to start working with a group of faculty members to come up with some programming, very specific programming, including hopefully classroom work to help students interact differently with each other. But the students themselves are actually coming up with informal ways of educating each other about different issues. We are actually promoting conversations with different viewpoints on the same platform, because typically what happens, mostly because of it's difficult to get to pay for multiple speakers on the same platform. We're trying to make sure that students have the money to be able to do that. So they tend to invite one person at a time. We would like to have 3 or 4 people off the same topic coming from different perspectives. So you'll see that a lot more. So we're paying a lot more attention to that. So you'll see more in the next couple of years, particularly given the social and political climate. We feel it's very important to double down on those kind of skill sets for students. And so with student leadership, Marvin and I are trying to work on that now. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And just to add a little, we're fortunate here at Yale to have the most powerful mechanism for promoting learning from each other and civil discourse, which in my view is the residential colleges, because we force, because we require students to live together and for at least 2 years. Because we mix them up, and you can't really choose to live and spend all your time with people who are like yourselves. And because we put so much resources into the dining hall community and after-hour evening buttery community, students really always find themselves in settings where they can meet people who are different from themselves and hear their different perspectives. And and sometimes it can be tense, but at least where people are in conversation. And so coupled with the programs that Kim has described that we're working hard to develop, I think we are in a good position to address this. It is a very high priority for us.
Over, woman right there.
Pat Williams, class of 71. I was in Pearson. Drunken parties at Yale have gotten a lot of publicity lately. And
Which parties?
Sorry, could you say that
drunken,
again?
Brett
Drunken
Kavanaugh
parties?
parties.
Oh, drunken parties, okay.
And I'm wondering what attention is paid to that aspect of substance abuse on campus.
We do a lot of training for students when they initially come in about our policies, and we have a number of students on campus who, they're called the Communication and Consent Coordinators, who talk a little bit about how to party effectively and work with student organizations to make sure that they're doing something appropriately, effectively, meaning safely. Sometimes what we find out is that when the parties on campus, they're actually well done, and they're safe, but when students go off campus, that's where we have more problems. So we're spending a lot more time with fraternities and sororities, mostly fraternities, to have conversations with them about what our expectations are and monitoring them in very different ways. But we're also spending a lot of time, frankly, with the students themselves to make sure that they're looking out for each other and they understand how to party a little bit more safely. So we haven't had as many issues on campus. In fact, one of the innovations that Marvin did this year was to have a huge party the first weekend that the first year's class came on. So that all of campus cross campus was taken over. Old campus was taken over for something we call the Bulldog Bash, which is something we've done for 2 years running, which is a party that we throw with the Schwartzman Center and Marvin's team throws, which has 5 acts going from 9:30 to 2 p.m. 2 a.m. It feels like 2 p.m. for those of us who are actually there. And it does have a beer garden where you have to, older students can go in, including graduate students, lots of food. And basically, it is so much fun that nobody actually ever goes away from that. And so they have an experience of having a really good, that first party being really, really fun, meeting people in a safe environment, and having better sets of ideas about how to party more safely other places. So we're trying to have, again, programming, good modeling, and a lot of conversations with students that we think might be problematic early on.
I was a college head for 9 years, and I've run many events with alcohol, beer, and wine for my senior students, and I've not had a single student misbehave or get sick at any of the events that I hosted. And what this told me was that if we can throw a party that serves alcohol and treat the students like adults, the young adults that they are, then they respond and act responsibly as well. The big problem is that the drinking age of 21 forces our students to have these underground, under-supervised parties, which are happening off campus, and that has just been a real big challenge to address and regulate. That said, just on the notion of Bulldog Bash Party, we're going to do a miniature version of that for you all tonight on Old Campus at 9 p.m. And to help you model good behavior.
Make sure to bring your ID.
Yeah, the party will be dry, so please pregame before you arrive.
We have 3 minutes, so I'm going to try to get to 2 questions, something that you really want to ask of this panel. Yep, right back there. Yes, you. Yeah.
Which one? So my name is Sarah Fox. I'm class of 73. We certainly were at Yale during what you could call a hyper-politicized time. But one of the things that's been striking to me as we've walked around the campus is how tranquil it is, how quiet it is. You don't see political posters. You don't see anything about political events. There was as millions of people around the world were demonstrating on climate change yesterday, there was a little, if there were 35 people out in front of Sterling Library during a little rally, they were out on the green, and that's where Yale students were. So anyway, so that's my question, I guess. Just what is the sense now about sort of political activism at Yale? Has that changed about women, particularly at a time now where certain aspects of women's rights seem to be very much under threat? What is your sense of how the student body feels about itself as engaged in the world?
I think we have a highly engaged student body across the board in a lot of ways. The reason why you don't see posters is because everything's on the internet right now. So they do Facebook, they connect with each other that way. It's less posters. But this is, certainly if you've been here, first of all, they're sleeping, so that's why you don't really see them right now. But for the last couple of years, certainly they have been very much in the mix. Many of them are spending a lot of time off campus in campaigns. They're doing work, in legal organizations. But we have a very politically savvy, socially responsible group of students who represent a broad range of views. So don't let the tranquility, which actually, by the way, I enjoy right now as a dean of students, don't let that fool you, because they are very much active, very active. And I think you would be proud that they are still carrying on the tradition of being of service in a variety of ways, in a variety of countries, actually, I would say. So they are definitely, would you agree? Yeah.
As a former college president, the only thing I would say is it was always great when our students were focusing their political activities against the national issues outside the college and not necessarily against the administration.
Yeah. Exactly.
There's someone over here who's been trying to, yeah, right here.
No, this one.
Right in front, yes. No,
Okay, thank you. I'm Ruth Termel, Morris 71. I'm just curious about the question of leadership and what happens to people after they leave here and how you define that these days, particularly with the emphasis on pre-professional, partly because of the cost of living, cost of college. A lot of more students are on financial aid, so like everybody does what they do here and then they go work for whoever can pay them the most. So I just, since we talk about leadership, how do you define it now?
So we track what students are doing after graduation very carefully. We have good statistics starting from the class of 2013, and so for that class, we even have data from 5 years out. Basically, I think we can be very proud of our young alumni that they engage very broadly, including in many areas of public service, arts, nonprofits. To further encourage that, President Salovey approved this new program called Domestic Summer Awards, which will pay students on financial aid to work for a nonprofit organization over the summers, so that these financial concerns would not constrain the types of education and experiences that they would pursue while they're here at Yale. And we're seeing the impact, I think we're going to see the impact of that continue even after graduation. And also just one other additional statistic about our students is that a lot of them go work, but by 5 years out from graduation, over half of them come do some form of graduate or professional school education. So I think that's a pretty cool statistic as well.
And Yale's financial aid policies are incredibly generous, and so students are able to graduate without loan burdens. So those do not constrain decisions about what they can do afterwards.
yeah. Just very quickly, do you think the definition of leadership has changed with women being so much a part of Yale, or is it the measures are still the same and women are meeting or exceeding those measures?
I asked this question because I have a lot of students working in my office about what constitutes leadership at Yale College. And what they said is, we typically think of the leadership positions on campus as being the head of the YDN, YCC, those organizations. And most recently, the most recent woman who was head of the YCC was actually just last year, and I think there's been a 10-year hiatus since the last woman who was head of it. But most of the students would say that yes, those organizations are wonderful, but what they see as leadership now are leadership in the 600 organizations that we now have, leadership on issues of social justice and a lot of the things that are really moving the campus in ways that sometimes are uncomfortable for us are really being led by women, and honestly, women of color are really stepping into the place, talk about intersectionality. So I think for this generation, the concept of leader is broader than we would typically say, and that most students see themselves as being leaders in some way, shape, or form, mostly because they all want to make some kind of an impact. And what I think the shift has been is actually they want to make an impact at home. So many more of them are going back home to make an impact. That's probably the shift, and that's where they see their leadership as having
this word leadership has a long and strange history if you think about it. Everyone smirks if you say 1,000 male leaders, but everyone knows a school like Yale doesn't just accept some students. It tries to develop the talent of students who are going to have disproportionate impact. But also, these students have lived with pressure. To apply to a college nowadays, you have to have been the president of at least 3 clubs in high school. And that's to say, you've been pushed into a certain definition of what leadership is, which means I have the foremost role, I have a certain prestige or something of that sort. I think by the time people get out and in life, they understand that's not really what leadership was about. It wasn't about the position you held. It's about thinking about how people take their gifts and go have a disproportionate impact, how they make other people smarter, how they ask more interesting questions, how they make people think that impossible ideas might be less impossible than they appear. And if I look in this room and see people who I can see with careers in medicine, with careers in architecture, with careers in academics, the world needs all of those people. It doesn't need everyone to be the president of those things, but it needs people to be the leader in more or less the sense I've described.
And I think students would agree. I think they see leadership as service.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, panelists. That's a big applause.